much. Right. So thanks for joining, everybody. We're going to be talking about a game called Nonstop Knight and how we go about creating that game. So first things first, I'll obviously talk about myself. So my name is Arto. I'm a bit of a systems designer, economic kind of a guy at the moment at Flaregames, so kind of an Excel designer. Obviously, I work with Nonstop Knight at the moment. Before this, I have experience with working with quite a few different teams and quite a few different free-to-play mobile projects. Nonstop Knight, for me, for my career, is a bit of an outlier, and it's not just the case for me, but that's how a lot of people working with this game feel, that there's just something unique about how we make it. And that's why I'm here today, to give you some insights into what I think is unique and cool about the process. Right, so some basic facts about the game. Have you guys played this one? Right, so Nonstop Knight is a bit of a streamlined action RPG. It has an incremental economy, so overlap with games like Tap Titans, Adventure Capitalist, and the like. We're doing it together with Flaregames and Kopla Games. We launched it earlier this year. It says here 5 million installs. I believe we're over 6 at the moment, but who cares? It's a number that's growing. In general, we're all very, very happy with the results so far. For those of you who like numbers, I have a few slides. So this is the retention curve, as we had it at the early data points, at our early soft launch. What we realized there, even with a very early version of the game, that the game had very strong early metrics, early engagement metrics, but at the same time, at that point, the game got stale pretty fast. You ran out of things to do, so the later retention we considered that to suck and something we needed to aggressively improve on. And that is what we did, and we did succeed to a point. So by the time we went for launch, we had more or less double the day 30 retention. If you're wondering or evaluating if these are good numbers, bad numbers, know that these are not our averages or anything like this. So I had to control for the install source to isolate the effect. And what this means is this is, in fact, pretty high quality install cohort. So if you see a number there that you don't believe, that's the reason. Similar story for revenue. So at an early stage, the game had some promise. So we had a fairly decent conversion rate at the time, yet at the same time, the monetization was very front-loaded. So most of the money was coming from the first days after install, and definitely nothing happening after day 30 or so. So it wasn't exactly game of war at the time. This was also something we improved on quite a lot. So the realized revenue at day 30 at launch time was more than double of the early numbers. And of course, the shape of the curve is much healthier. So we have much, much more elder game revenue coming from outside the graph. And this is also something we've improved on quite a lot, and there's a very good trend there, so we're on a good track there. Right, so my agenda for today is pretty simple. I wanted to give you an intro on the game that we did, also show you some graphs that we did. Next, I'm going to talk about who's making the game. That will make it easier to kind of go into how we make the game. And then finally, I'll talk about design collaboration or working as a team in design in general and on Nonstop Knight. So first, who's making the game? I already mentioned it's a collaboration between Flaregames and Kopla Games. What that looks like on a timeline is this. So Kopla Games, they were doing the game for quite some time with a team of 4, and then you can quite clearly see the point in which we went all in and started staffing up both on the Kopla side and on Flaregames side. Now, if you work with project management, this is probably a bit of a scary graph. We did manage to scale up pretty smoothly. I'll go into detail on what that meant for design. But yeah, here you get the big picture. So with that knowledge, just a warm-up question, how do small teams and big teams differ when it comes to making games? So I listed some interesting differences. Big teams, to begin with, they have a bit of an advantage due to their size. So you have economies of scale. You might have multiple game projects, so learnings from one game carry over to the next one. And also you can have the luxury of specialists. All very powerful things, at least in theory, and if you use them right. Now, smaller teams, they have a lot of good stuff as well. Due to their size, they have lower overhead, less risk for politics, or rather like doing the things for wrong reasons. Also very important, they're much faster to react and adapt than larger teams, and also much less scared to fail. than larger teams tend to be. Then if we look at kind of like the typical products of these teams, I think large teams tend to create these large games that are optimized, but often have little to no soul and no innovation. That definitely need not be the case, but in the mobile free-to-play space, especially if you look at the games that larger teams are pushing out, this is often just the case. And of course, there's a risk of waste. So larger teams, you have all of that good corporate stuff going on with endless meetings, PowerPoint presentations, initiatives that lead to little value in the actual product. So there's a risk for that. Smaller teams, on the other hand, I think they have an advantage when it comes to creating games with a stronger product identity. Yet at the same time, small teams tend to make small games. So that means a more modest feature set, not that much content, and ultimately they're somewhat limited in their revenue potential. Now I wanted to mention this because in this project we have a bit of both though. Flaregames as a larger company has some characteristics of the big team archetype here. For the negative stuff I mentioned, I think we're fairly good at avoiding them. Yet there's always a risk for that, so it's good to acknowledge that stuff. But more importantly, if we look at Nonstop Knight and how that game looked like, let's say 8 months ago, it was very much described by this box here, and even more importantly, Kopla games. The way I describe the small team archetype here, I believe Kopla is a very extreme example of that. So all of these points absolutely apply. All right, so let's talk a bit about them. So how does Kopla Games develop their games? First off, this is a team that's not very interested in making derivative games or being like a follower in the market. Actually, their intent is more or less to break the action RPG space on mobile, so they want to create something new. And how they do that, first they accept that they don't know the unknown, so to say. They don't necessarily know what's good for their game either in the short term. So what they tend to do is they just try out a lot of stuff and let the process, or the game rather, teach them. So this is very descriptive of how these guys think and develop the game. Right, so Nonstop Knight as well is a product of this mutation process that they foster. The term for that they use is brute forcing luck. And what that means for the game is that Nonstop Knight has had like 1,000,001 different experiments and different phases. A lot of the iconic things about the game, such as the portrait orientation or the incremental economy, those were things that also were not there from the beginning, but they were discovered on the way through some experiment. Right, so how does this work? First of all, we tend to do very little upfront design. So more often than not, we design experiments rather than full sensible features. Second, you're supposed to move as fast as you can. So quick and dirty is often enough to kind of learn something or validate an idea. Third, this is very interesting. So if you allow for it, you kind of tend to run into these happy accidents. And we've seen this a lot. So a lot of the cool things that are currently in the game, we found out kind of as a byproduct of something else that was tested at the time. So if you do test enough stuff and look for these things, there's a lot of value there. And fourth, of course, you're supposed to find out what doesn't work as fast as you can and then move on. Right, so I pretty much described iterative design there. That's not a new concept. These guys didn't invent it. What I think makes them special is just the fact that they're so regimented about it, and they're very good at it. So these guys are really, really fast at breaking their game and putting it together again. So what I think makes this team unique is just extreme, hardcore approach to wanting to validate things, not believing anything before they tried it, and this humble approach when it comes to design. That just shows on the product itself as well. So this approach does have some limitations. I listed one here. So the experimental process kind of only makes sense when the results are instant. So as an example, we might have 3, 4 experiments going into the game on a Wednesday, and then by Thursday we'd already know what we like about them and what we don't like about them. Now in cases where you would need to play for a longer time or kind of wait for the data to come in from the player base, all of this kind of loses its magic. So for that kind of stuff, you need to adopt another approach. All right, so with that in mind, I want to talk about how we design things as a larger than one group. These are, I think, pretty relevant questions for any design team. I'll go through all of these and how we work on Nonstop Knight. So first, it's good to know who does what independently. Second, at least implicitly, you kind of tend to know what are the topics that you design together or decide on together. That certainly cannot be all topics. And third, maybe most importantly, when you do work together, how do you make it efficient? This is not that easy. There's a lot of stuff that goes into the third point, and there's a lot of risk for inefficiency there as well. So, first question, who does what independently? Now, I talked about the brute forcing luck approach. That's represented here by Team Exciting. What that is in practice is 1 or 2 feature teams that kind of execute on that. So just to make it clear, the experimental process is not a thing they did at the early stages of the game. It's something that we constantly do, even now as the game is live. So what these guys would do is a bunch of experiments at the start of a sprint cycle, then get the learnings from that, and then focus on the good stuff, ship an update, and then repeat from the beginning. Now, I also mentioned the shortcomings. That's why we have Team Slow and Boring. That's where I live. So that's more focused on Excel sheets, looking at player data, very much focused on kind of the long tail of the game and the slower game loops and just the scaling of the whole thing, as well as data-driven optimization. So that's kind of the rough high-level split we do. Second, what do we work on together? Nonstop Knight, this is a bit of an everything and nothing answer. So we do try to get the input from the right people at the right time. And how we do that is we allow for push feedback through transparency. So you know what the other independent entities are doing at all times, so you can just jump in with stuff you thought of while walking your dog. Second, we have this culture of just asking for input, but maybe most importantly, the final point that in this project, there's nothing that comes even close to like an approval process. So there is not a point in which a piece of design gets this official stamp and then we move on with that and all that stuff. That is kind of a characteristic in other teams. So in the end, what we have is set up where we do seek input, but that's never a bottleneck. So even in the absence of input, everybody can move on as fast as they can. Finally, what I think makes the collaboration efficient in this game, and this is basically a collection of points I think are very good practices, but in this case it's more or less things that are forced on us by the iterative nature of the process. First, I think it's very good or important to know when to put a design topic on hold, to know when it's good enough, because if not, I mean, design discussions don't have an end. How this works on Nonstop Knight is we basically have an experiment lined up on a topic that gives us the cue of just waiting on the info from that, so we can kind of drop the topic for now, move on to the next one. This keeps us fast. Second, yeah, I mean, a lot of us try to create this environment where offering critique and shooting down bad ideas is as frictionless as possible, so none of the wrong reasons like personality comes into the way. Nonstop Knight, again, this comes pretty naturally because creating bad ideas or bad features is kind of a key part of the process. So if something stupid goes into the game in this game, that's not because somebody was an idiot because they thought it would work, but it's a fair guess. Third, goal-oriented product management is something we try to do at Flare with every project. What that basically means is, let's take the example of setting a strategic goal for an update, for instance. So what we do is we try to spend some energy in just framing the problem as well as we can, but leave a lot of room for the actual solution. So there's room for this discovery on the way. So we try to avoid being prescriptive on how to fix the game, so to say. again, you can imagine this is actually the only way we can work on Nonstop Knight, just due to the fact that we want to try everything before we believe in it. And then finally, I learned that high level of trust can really lead to productivity gains. And what that means is if you can reach the state of multi-directional trust or whatever, then you can kind of let go of a lot of the unnecessary control structures and everybody can just work faster. So this here was my final slide. I think for me it's more or less the most important one as well. So I think all very, very good points I thought I knew before working on this project, what they were kind of like force-fed to me, these learnings once again. Cool. Do you guys have any questions?
So, any questions, guys? Because I'll ask. Oh, there's one at the back there. It's always best to get someone else asking other than just me. We're going to get a microphone to you in just a second. Coming your way.
Thank you. For the testing, do you do the testing, I mean, especially the one that you didn't go live, you do it internally or do you have some other group that you test with?
So we rely on the intuition of the team mostly. So the process I mentioned earlier, where on a Wednesday we explode the game with some stupid test, and on a Thursday we know what we like, that's just the core team playing the game overnight. That's most of the info comes from there. They're pretty good with their judgment. They're kind of steering with the gut, so to say. On top of that, every now and then we do larger, test groups, and of course we look at the data. But what I mentioned first is kind of at the heart of the process.
Thanks.
Any other questions? There's one gentleman there.
Hi. What did you actually do to raise the retention and monetization?
It's kind of from building up from a million different components. So there's a lot of feature development, actually months of feature development there. Also, we put in more content. So at the time, you just ran out of goals. If you've played the game, we focused a lot on this ascension loop. It was in the game at the time as well, but it kind of sucked. Like the upgrades you did with the ascensions were not as good as they are now, and there was a lot of smaller tweaks we put in as such as the frenzy potions, all of that stuff. So gameplay variety, just giving the player goals for a longer time. Those were the biggest things, but on top of that, there's a lot of balancing through A/B testing and smaller things that also add up.
So I was going to ask something, because we talked about this earlier on before we started. I think this game was shown off at a big indie pitch here last year or recently, around that sort of time frame. And it's interesting because we're relatively informed judges. We look at things and we didn't pick it.
Right.
And actually, I kick myself a little bit because we kind of go, well, why didn't we pick it? And I think one of the reasons why I think that happened is because we have a series of internal biases. We see a certain number of trends, and we assume those trends are done. How does that process that you're describing, this brute force process, avoid those pitfalls of the wrong assumption, making those assumptions?
Well, I mean, you need to have good judgment and good intuition as a team. I mean,
but where does that, because I think the problem with good intuition, and why I like this process, this iterative kind of to the extreme process, is it kind of forces you to go beyond some of your assumptions. But it's really hard to step aside, isn't it? And to at least give yourself the space to experiment and fail.
Yeah, I see what you mean. I mean, I guess it's something that I believe these guys as well, and us when joining the game a bit late, had to get used to. So you don't just assume you know everything, but instead try to make the game better one step at a time and allow for the learnings there. I mean, if you have a misstep there, you can always go back and discard that. So,
I suppose it's like you say, it's the crux is having being humble enough to be willing to say, yeah, you're wrong about that. Let's try this again.
Yeah.
Any other questions? We have a question down here. I think we can get a mic down to you pretty swiftly. Just coming around now, on the front row. Thank you.
Thanks. Hi, Kimmo Kari from Rival Games. I worked previously actually in a publisher with Wilhelm Taht back in the days in France, and then I had a couple of times cases where I also supervised like executive producer the game projects. Cases where you had a good game, but then you think, for example, that yes, this user interface sucks, but hey, it's easy to fix. That we will do that later. But then sometimes I realize that the skill is missing from the team. And how have you faced such a situation that some skill is missing, and what you do in those situations
With this team?
No, in general.
In general, well, certainly. I mean, this team, I think what they do right is, first, they're pretty smart. Second, they know what they're lacking, so they pick the kind of project that suits the game. Sure enough, they were missing some skills and didn't have the focus for that, so what they could do, they could dump it on the publisher, which is Flaregames in this case. But certainly, I mean, I think if we talk about design specifically, I've seen a lot of cases, or we've seen as a Flare a lot of cases where that's not the case. So people kind of go on a project where they don't have the skills, being just the manpower to do the content the game needs, and very often economy design is also missing, so they don't have the Excel guy on a game that is very, very much dependent on that guy. So those are some of the typical things that are lacking.
In Flaregames, you don't personally really put your hands on to the game. If there is certain skill missing, for example, you don't really start doing the game for them. You more propose that hey, here's the problem. Hey,
right. So that varies case by case. We can get really hands-on, whatever helps best. On this example, we had 4 engineers work on the game. So doing SDK integrations, Android stuff, and all of the server stuff is by Flaregames engineer. Myself, I do the balancing for the game, so that is very, very hands-on. And basically that's because we didn't want to hire 5 more guys at Kopla side. It's just easier for us to do it.
And cool. So unfortunately, at that point, we have to move on.
Right.
Thank you so much. I think that was really, really insightful and useful. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.